Here in a small workshop in the Red River Valley, a monument is being built, one to honor a man long forgotten to history, a man who had joined the fight against those who kept his people in chains, an entrepreneur, and a pioneer. Felix Battles was born in the early 1840s. Like so many born enslaved, an exact date isn't known, nor is an exact location, though somewhere in the border region of Tennessee and Mississippi near Memphis is likely. What records survive serve as a stark artifact of a time when human beings could be bought and sold.
The first time we see his name in print, it's on a list of possessions from William Dawson, who owned one of the largest plantations near Holly Springs, Mississippi. And it says he's 14 years old. It says that his life is worth $600.
Marcus Kruger works for the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County in Moorhead, Minnesota. As part of his job studying local history, Kruger and his colleagues have been researching Felix Battles, who was born nearly 1,000 miles away. But like so many kept in bondage, Battles had dreams of making it north and escaping to freedom.
The next time we see his name in print, it's he's free. It's the 1860 census, so he's 18 years old. So sometime as a teenager, Felix Battles escaped slavery, and it's possible he was freed. But all signs point to Felix Battles freed himself.
While the details of Battles' presumed escape have been lost to history, one possibility as to how he came to the upper Midwest is by following a path taken by many slave-owning tourists of the day. Dr. Christopher Lehman, professor of ethnic studies at St. Cloud State University, explains.
Well, probably the best answer is that the Mississippi River is here. I mean, it's a direct waterway from the south to the north. I mean, that's why there is so much tourism in Minnesota, because there were people who came, in some cases, from all the way in New Orleans up to Minnesota for their vacations. But there were people who also used the river to find their way to freedom.
While the enslaved persons who accompanied their owners into free territories such as Minnesota would themselves be free, there was little incentive for those in the area to help such people.
In the time that Minnesota was in existence as a territory and a state, but still during the years of legal slavery in the country, Minnesota never had any official legal mechanism to free people who came here.
During this time, a trip from the deep south up the Mississippi River required travelers to take two different boats. The first, crewed by slaves, and, from St. Louis on up, a second, operated by European Americans that would take travelers into free territory.
And if you were an African American on these boats, you would definitely stick out like a sore thumb if you didn't have a master or a mistress with you. So that probably made using the river for freedom difficult.
As Battles and others made their way north to freedom, tensions between the North and South were starting to reach their boiling point in Washington. After decades of debating and compromising over the institution of slavery, South Carolina seceded from the United States in 1860 and would soon be joined by 10 other states. Months later, Confederate forces would attack the federal Fort Sumter, starting off 4 years of bloody conflict. In the midst of the conflict, President Lincoln would issue the Emancipation Proclamation, an ultimatum to the rebelling states that would free all enslaved persons in the Confederacy if those states did not return to the Union.
And it was only on New Year's Day in 1863 that the Confederate slaves became free, at least on paper. But in order to make their freedom a reality, Lincoln had to win the war. And in order to help the Union win the war, he needed more troops.
It was then that the Union Army began accepting African American recruits, forming what was known as the United States Colored Troops.
Armed African American soldiers, armed former slaves, was the nightmare of the Confederacy. This was antithetical to everything that the Confederacy stood for. They didn't think that black men could good soldiers, but they were proved wrong.
In August of 1864, Felix Battles left his steamboat job and enlisted in the Union Army at Fort Snelling in St. Paul, Minnesota. Having escaped the horrors of slavery in the South, he would now return to fight against it.
They risked their lives, they risked their freedom to end the system of slavery by returning south and fighting the Confederacy in the United States Army uniform.
These brave men would also face a danger unknown to others in the Union Army.
It was official Confederate policy that African American soldiers were not soldiers. These United States soldiers were escaped slaves, and if they were to be captured, it was their policy to either murder them or re-enslave them.
Felix would rise to become a corporal in the 18th U.S. Colored Infantry. He would be one of over 50,000 Union troops who would see action in the Battle of Nashville in December of 1864. A decisive Union victory, it would result in the near destruction of the Army of Tennessee, the largest rebel army in the Western theater of the war.
At the end of that battle, there was no more Confederate army that's in the West anymore, so they utterly destroyed it at the Battle of Nashville.
After the conclusion of the Civil War, Felix would return to Minnesota and married Kate Gill of Missouri. It was also around this time he would find work with the Northern Pacific Railroad. As the railroads expanded west, many new settlements would spring up along the route to the Pacific. But it was the town of Moorhead, Minnesota that Felix chose to call home, settling in the early 1870s. The new community included Felix, his wife Kate, and eventually their two children, Richard and Julia. It's believed that they were the first African-American family in the town. Felix didn't take long to settle down. He would eventually become a well-known traveling barber in the community.
Being a barber was about the best job that a black man could have in the United States at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. One of the rare professions that a black man could be his own boss, earn good money, and be respected as a professional is by being a barber.
After working as a traveling barber for over a decade, Felix would open his own shop in the high-class J. Cook Hotel building on Center Avenue in Moorhead in 1888.
I feel like back in the old days, right? It's kind of the cornerstone. It's the cornerstone of the community, right?
Delson Santel is a barber who owns multiple shops in the Red River Valley. He explains the significance Felix's shop would have had to the community.
There were not many black barbers, obviously, especially up north here, where Felix was, and it was just for white males that came in. It was essentially a term of they were higher class, right? So they're able to be with a black barber just because they were higher class.
The shop was advertised as a modern and luxurious establishment in the growing pioneer town. As Moorhead grew, so did its black population. By the 1885 state census, the Battles were joined by relatives of Kate as well as the Taylors, another African-American family. These families accounted for 9 of the 16 African Americans in the 2,500-person town. It would be these 16 that would make up the original black community of the Red River Valley. As a successful business owner, Felix became a leader in the African American community of Moorhead. Newspaper accounts wrote of him opening his home to the community for dinners, dancing, and games. Felix would continue to cut hair until 1905, when he suffered a stroke that would force him to close his barber shop and request an army pension. He would receive this in the form of $12 per month until his death 2 years later in 1907. Felix would be buried in a simple grave in northern Moorhead. At his death, he would be mourned as an important member of the community.
In his obituary, it said that he was respected by all who knew him. And all of the old soldiers and all the old settlers were going to be at his funeral, at his house.
Felix was survived only by his son Richard, with his wife and daughter having died previously. With the passing of Richard in 1916, the original black community in Moorhead was in decline. This period also coincided with the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Unlike its original form, this second wave wasn't only confined to the Deep South, spreading nationwide, including the Fargo-Moorhead region. In just a short amount of time, the attitude of the community underwent a dramatic change, from celebrating a black community leader to holding Klan rallies and parades only blocks from where Battles lived and worked. Though the Klan wouldn't last long in Moorhead, it would be decades before new pioneers arrived.
And we came here, we were the third African American. The African American was a young lieutenant who was a recruiting officer in the Army. So for about the first 3 or 4 years we were here, we were the only African Americans here.
Dr. Yvonne Condell is Professor Emeritus of Biology at Minnesota State University Moorhead. Condell, along with her husband James, were the first African American professors at the university.
I grew up in the South before thoughts about affirmative action, the rights of humans, how people could make choices not based on somebody else's decision.
Despite the widespread disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South, Condell was raised in a family that valued education.
I had 3 generations of educated people, which was very unusual to have somebody who grew up in the Deep South. But we were very fortunate because both of my parents understood we were going to college, and there's no doubt about it.
When the Condells arrived on campus in 1965, they didn't find a very diverse population. Records show that just 7 African American students were enrolled in 1967. However, by 1968, the university, then Moorhead State College, began Project Equality. This initiative had the goal of attracting students of various identities and backgrounds to the campus. It was founded by several faculty members and students under the leadership of University President John J. Neumeyer, a man who had a deep personal belief in equality.
I feel very strong about the oppression against minorities, the discrimination, extremely strongly. And the reason is simple. It's because I was a Jew in Germany, and I felt there was something like that in being a black in the West.
After Neumeyer left the university, his vision would be carried on by a successor, President Roland Dill, and program director Lois Selberg.
On the day that the State College Board had planned to interview me and name me president, Martin Luther King was killed. They appointed me later, before Bobby Kennedy was dead. But before I took over the president's office, we had seen the Democratic Convention, and we knew that the voices of thoughtfulness and care were silenced, and the hard men had taken over. A citizen who hated me because there were black students on the campus poured black paint over my car, and another citizen called us from time to time and told us that our children would be kidnapped and bodily destroyed. After Kent State, there was turmoil on this campus, a student strike, all sorts of things said, kinds of things we needed to do. And having decided in what was billed as a confrontation to end the strike, I left my office to go to the student union, but before I got out of the office, the telephone rang. And a man said, I'm a major in the highway patrol. I have 23 highway patrolmen in Dilworth, and we're coming on campus to keep the peace. And I said, no, you're not. You can't come on campus until I send for you.
The initiative would prove to be a success, recruiting 50 students in its first year. 35 African Americans, 8 Native Americans, and 7 Mexican American students would make their way to Moorhead thanks to Project Equality. The initiative would last until 1974, at which time it was folded into the Office of Student Activities. Like so many other colleges and universities across the United States, the 1960s and 70s would prove to be a turbulent time for Moorhead State. Protests over the Vietnam War and later Watergate would consume the campus. Racially motivated violence would also rear its ugly head as the school began to diversify. Despite these setbacks, the work towards making campus and the broader community more inclusive would continue. Project Equality's original mission continues under MSUM's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, led by Jared Pidgeon.
Our main goals across the campus is enrollment and equity, and they're intertwined. You can have enrollment without equity, but you can't really have equity, without enrollment, and it kind of goes hand in hand.
And as the region would grow more diverse, so would the needs for services for African Americans. Despite Felix closing his shop in 1905, it would only be recently that a black-owned barbershop would return to the region.
Before Skill Cuts opened, there wasn't a barbershop around here for African Americans, and essentially it was friends giving each other haircuts or family members giving each other haircuts. And when Skill Cuts finally opened, it just finally brought a sense, and there wasn't that many barbershops or salons in this area that were able to do African American hair.
Well over 100 years after Felix Battles came to Moorhead, his legacy was starting to come full circle.
There are very few memorials to enslaved people in Minnesota. I suppose one reason would be that there were so few enslaved people in Minnesota. But for the people who we know, there are ways to pay tribute to them once we learn their stories.
With the goal in mind of honoring those whose history had long been ignored, the idea of erecting a new statue was sparked by many old ones being dismantled.
I'm a Civil War nerd. And it was, gosh, it was 5 years ago. The Civil War monuments were definitely in the news. And like everybody else, I'm watching it on TV, and I said, who deserves a statue a lot more than Robert E. Lee is Felix Battles.
Marcus's idea grew as he partnered with community leaders to help develop the project plans. Its goal of honoring local Black history appealed to Minnesota State University Moorhead's Diversity and Inclusion Office.
By doing things like this right here, students will not only be able to see themselves, but this place, this, gathering point, healing point, reflection point, whatever you call it, probably will become something greater than we don't know right now.
Initially conceived in 2018, the project faced numerous obstacles. But after years of setbacks and delays, the team persevered. By the summer of 2023, construction had finally begun. Made of thick steel plate, a high-pressure water jet cutter was used to precisely carve out what will become Felix's statue. One of the challenges in creating the statue is that no known picture exists of Felix. In his place, a picture of an unknown Union soldier was chosen.
The idea of showing an unknown soldier means that he stands for everybody.
The statue would not only honor Felix, but all of the nearly 180,000 African Americans who bravely served alongside him in the USCT. Another hurdle was deciding where Felix would stand. After all options were weighed, the location chosen was one that would be familiar to Battles himself. His memorial would stand proudly on the former site of his Moorhead home. By October, the concrete foundation had been poured. And finally, after years of planning, the statue came out of storage and was carefully installed by volunteers just days before its November 4th dedication. The long-awaited day had finally arrived. Inside the Passaic School of Business next to the statue site, a gathering was held for community members, students, and project owners.
So while I am honored to stand before you today on behalf of MSUM and the Moorhead community to welcome the statue to our campus and to say to a brother in arms and in spirit, welcome home.
The crowd braved chilly fall weather for the dedication ceremony, but it wasn't just Felix's history that was being commemorated.
When we think about the land in which we stand on, this being indigenous land, first and foremost, if we do not call attention to the history, we're sort of erasing our own history.
While the ribbon cutting was the end of one project, it's only the beginning for honoring a history long ignored, and the man who finally has a permanent home on campus.
This here signals a positive step in which, when we think about community building and we think about how do we come together and acknowledge parts of our past and create shared destiny together, that's what today shows.
We need this. It's representation. We need representation. You know, and this is for the younger generation. We hope that someone steps up and does miracles.
It has been the desire of many people to make sure that we honor the heroes, although they have been departed many, many years, but the spirit of the Black Barber and Felix battle, I think it emphasizes more than just a place to have your hair cut.
Yeah, my personal thoughts was really one of we've came a long way. We've came a long way.